Hi, I'm Susan Murray. I'm an associate professor of media culture and communication at NYU. Um, and this is Anne.
I'm Helen Petersen, and I am a PhD student in the Department of Radio and Television and Film at the University of Texas. And I'm also the author of Celebrity Gossip Academic Style, which is a blog.
So today we're going to talk about probably a range of things, but we really want to use as a starting off point kind of the most recent example of kind of media spectacle, media hoax, which was the balloon boy incident of a week or so ago. And so Anne and I talked a little bit about this, and we see some similar patterns. But Anne, you were talking about the narrative of the balloon boy coverage and how the story unfolded. What can you tell me what you sort of thought of that as it was happening or since then?
Well, similar to, I think, other incidents that kind of evaporate or come out of nowhere, right? There's something very spectacular that comes, and then we kind of fill in the blanks of what the story of that event was retrospectively, right? So whether it's Octomom, right? Like suddenly there's these 8 babies, and then we go back and investigate and figure out like what kind of person or what role she can make within like the grander narrative of this story, right? So making it into a narrative the same way that if this were made into a made-for-TV movie, how would this story be told? So I think the most kind of salient points that have emerged from the Balloon Boy hoax, as it's called, is the backstory with his parents and the fact that they were aspiring actors. They met in LA at the Stellar Adler School. And how they moved to Colorado and then began taping these, they're called Science, PSYCIENC. Basically, it was a series, like a web series of this combination of kind of like paranormal science, but also like chasing tornadoes and this sort of thing. Basically as celebrity seekers, right? As people who were interested in profiting or making a living, just a general living off of being famous. And that is what led to the kind of confluence of the scientific kind of aspirations with making this balloon in the first place, and then the spectacle and the impulse to get on television, right? So the fact that they called the local news station and the sort of thing to have it be filmed, that became kind of the spine of the hoax, I guess. But then just the fact that they've turned the characters involved in the story into, like, you know, the evil father, the quiet mother, the innocent child, the dubious public, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think the dubious public is actually probably what people are most concerned about, although I noticed, too, when I was seeing the sort of post-coverage, is this shame by news organizations that they felt they were duped as well, and so we had to kind of publicly have a sort of airing out of that moment, perhaps so that it doesn't actually involve the news agencies, that we don't sort of, the lack of trust doesn't kind of spill over. But what I was thinking of when I was watching the coverage is really, I had this odd feeling that maybe this was sort of the beginning of the end of this reality TV cycle. And the reason I thought that was certainly our response, and I think an audience response of somewhat disillusionment. I think you used the word fatigue in our earlier conversation about this, that there is a kind of exhaustion with the reality TV process, but also with those who are seeking celebrity and fortune through reality TV. That, we came to the genre for at least its claims to engaging with ordinary people, and yet ordinary people now are going to it to become extraordinary people, going to it to have a life of celebrity, sometimes with, very problematic exchanges involved in that.
Yeah. Well, and I think, this idea that there's a way in which you can become you can cultivate your own reality stardom, right? And instead of becoming an actor, someone who has things that we would normally associate with talent and movie stars, right? So being extraordinarily beautiful or being extraordinarily talented as an actor, you can be the most outrageous, right? Or the most overweight or the most pathological, like all of these different issues that you can cultivate to be a superlative in some sort of way, and get yourself onto one of these shows, right? So I think that the family, the Balloon Boy family, very much realized that, like, if they could be the weirdest, then that is what, like, the producers of Wife Swap were looking for. That they want to put these wives, or like when they swap the wives, into the most alienating situation as possible. So if you can make yourself out to play this family that's the most weird, then that will be more. You'll be more likely to be on that.
And that if you're the character that has kind of some sort of aggression, or there is a great NPR piece. I think it might have been. I don't know if it was This American Life or All Things Considered, did a piece about this guy was talking about the statement of reality TV show. People have like, I'm not in it for friendship, as being a signal of the character that's usually going to become the center of the attention of the narrative. They're usually the evil, that statement themselves positions them as the bad guy, who usually makes it quite far and gets all sorts of media attention, and also is most remembered in the end, and may not win the prize, but wins the prize of celebrity after the moment. And so I think the father's engagement on Wife Swap was also about that kind of display of being, the anti-hero in some ways, right?
Yeah. Well, it also plays in, what's odd to me is that it plays into a lot of these kind of descriptors that we use to describe, like, Americanism, right? So the cult of the individual, like relying on yourself and doing whatever is necessary to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and succeed on the show, sometimes by devious means, which isn't necessarily American. But, right, like, it's if we can win, that's what attracts us to these people, is that they're winners.
Right.
But then at the same time, all of these qualities in some ways are really offensive, or we feel good about disliking them, right? About identifying what they are and what we're not, which I think is part of the attraction of reality television, is we're like, that is a real person on that screen, and I am so much not that real person, right?
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
Yeah, so like we were talking earlier about the kind of the pleasure that people take in hating Spencer and Heidi from The Hills.
Yes.
And how...
Spidey.
Yes, Spidey. And how they're obviously the villains of that show and have been formed in contrast to the other players on the show to be these kind of, not only just like not very nice, right, like vicious human beings, but also profiting off of celebrity. And there's something that we're supposed to not like about that. It's not natural. It's not authentic. And I was saying that the publicist for Spencer and Heidi contacted me to write a review of their new book for my blog. And of course I'll do it because it's a fascinating opportunity. Not only why would they want me, who I comment critically on celebrity in my blog or analyze celebrity, to review this book, but also because the book itself is probably going to be really interesting. It could either be really interesting or it could be really banal, but one thing I'm interested in is the way that they lay out how they play the game.
Right. Which I think is the part of the issue where I was talking about the fatigue from audiences, is that, in a sense, they enjoyed, of course, we've heard the term, the savvy viewer, the viewer that considers themselves to be intelligent and knowledgeable about backstories, not just in terms of what's on the backstories within the narrative, but backstories of production and so forth. And so there's a relationship. So many times I would get questions about reality TV that are often like, well, assuming that everybody else but you know that it's not really real, but really the rest of the audience, right? If you ever interviewed about reality TV, that's often the assumption of interviewers, that you are the only smart one that knows, and you sort of have this way of playing with reality. But the truth is, I think, particularly at this point in the cycle, but I think it was even true in the beginning, that most viewers enjoy that play of like figuring out what's real, what's not, the games, that sort of truth games of authenticity, finding those moments perhaps within the kind of morass of construction that are authentic, which usually is about emotions. That seem like, oh, well, actors would have a difficult time conveying that kind of emotion. So there must be something genuine about that. Yeah. So there's something that's playful and pleasurable about what reality TV offers in regards to that. And yet, when you get to see too much to the inside of both the intention of the players, the intention of the contestants or characters on on that, to that they have goals to, to be famous, goals to make money and so forth that aren't about the actual narrative, as well as the way in which, yes, like there are 4 steps you could take to become a reality star, breaks with that pleasure, I think, certainly, and then makes you feel kind of like a dupe. And why do I want to watch somebody who's only trying to kind of exploit the genre in the process and get attention?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, part of it, so like you were talking about, part of it is the fact that they're making the mechanisms visible, right? Which can be pleasurable, right? So Jason Mattel and others have talked about narrative complexity and how we take pleasure in like puzzle piecing things together and being very conscious of what's going on the screen in front of us. And I would say that some reality television definitely employs these tropes of narrative complexity. But at the same time, I think seeing too much of, like, as one of my teachers would say, how the sausage gets made, right? Makes us, it's repulsive in some ways, right? Because it shows how easy it is to manufacture these tropes of authenticity and absolutely and spontaneity and that sort of thing. And along those lines, like what happened a couple of weeks ago with the person who kind of was operated in the reality circles, right, appearing in all of these different reality shows on VH1 dating shows, who, because of basically faults in the system, hadn't had an adequate background check and had a severe history in domestic abuse and ended up murdering his wife, right? So that shows how the kind of this pathology of mass production that goes on behind the scenes, and how now it's almost as if like reality television has become this crutch of programming in general, and instead of, actually trying to entertain us, they're just pumping out derivative programs. And in some ways, right, and whenever there's a point in television history where there seems to be a glut of too much, right, when a certain genre has become popular and then everyone starts emulating it, I think we start to talk about viewer fatigue with too many of one thing, right? So like Westerns in the late 50s and early 60s leads to, oftentimes the way that we narrativize it is it leads to kind of innovation, right? So a glut of bad television leads to really good television. So I wonder if this is what we're thinking. We're like, well, now that we're sick of reality television, maybe we can get some actually good television on TV. But I think with the crisis in the networks and with television and advertising dollars in general, I don't know if that's actually going to be a reality.
Right. Well, we've had that kind of disparity between, not disparity, but a difference, a bifurcation of the reality TV, which actually obviously takes up the majority of the cable and network schedules, and then kind of more seemed understood generally as high quality television that are engaged in narrative complexity, like a Lost, right? That is supposed to have also a life outside of its initial run, which shows like American Idol don't, right? They don't have the second run syndication built in. Lost 2 might be a little more difficult to syndicate, but it has potential for DVD and for dedicated viewers and so forth. So there's been that play of those two kind of types of viewing experiences. And yet, so they might have to kind of find something to replace the one that's cheap and easy and rapidly proliferates, because they don't actually, have it in them to keep producing many really high-end programming, in terms of production costs, at least, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and if you look at something like The Bachelor, right, like the way that show functions, it really feeds into itself. So, like, the person who the audience really liked from the season before who didn't get picked becomes the new contestant. So you have a built-in audience for that next show. Right? So these shows are very self-perpetuating. I mean, in American Idol, there's always going to be this mass of willing contestants who want to participate and watch themselves being on the show, or watch others, watch the pleasure and watch the disaster of others. But again, how long can a format, right, a certain format remain salient or remain, keep touching something in the American public? Like, I mean, are we actually seeing a downswing in the programming of reality television? We talked earlier about how The Hills is, enjoyed this ratings spike probably about 3 or 4 years ago, but has been gradually declining. Real World is declining. I think American Idol is staying strong, but that is in part due to the charisma, the specific personalities introduced in this last season. And
And they too have
just
actually had their own scandals involving.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just if there's another show, like one thing that we can think about is has there been a recent introduction, like a new reality show that has become popular? And I can't think of one that has like become part of the zeitgeist in the way that those other shows have.
Right, or that is not part of kind of a formatting cycle. So like Bravo, Project Runway brings, Top Chef brings, et cetera, that are in a similar format. And I think there's something about the sort of rapidity, the rapid nature of the output of cycles instead of seasons, right? And that's a big change that reality TV brought to television was, we don't think in terms of those traditional seasons anymore. Yeah. And we get a news cycle, it seems like endlessly. Like something that's only been on the air for maybe 3 or 4 years has 13 cycles, which gives this sense of kind of constant abundance or sort of, overkill maybe to somebody else in regards to the relentless nature of reality TV. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and if you think too about like this idea of abundance, I really like that the number of players that are involved in this, right? So how many like top 10 contestants have been involved in something like Top Chef over how many cycles have happened? How many people have you, like as a viewer, been asked to relate to or identify with? Right,
exactly.
Right? And I mean, one thing that we can also think of is like, what are these people famous for? What are they remarkable for? They're remarkable for being themselves. They don't have any talent, like a specific talent. Some of them do, right? So, like, I think that's one of the reasons why there's not as much fatigue with shows like Top Chef or even Project Runway, right? Because there are skills evidenced in these shows. Whereas in some other ones, or even American Idol, right? So these people have actual talent at doing something. Whereas in some of these shows, their talent is being famous, right? Is generating a cult of personality around themselves. And I think that's why even this, like, what happened with Bubble Boy, right, is not that the father was a brilliant scientist or even that they had that innovative ideas. It's that he knew how to tap into something that would induce a certain reaction from all of the nation.
Right. And again, understanding the process almost too well, like you were talking about with Spidey, with Spencer and Heidi, right? Is that idea that if they don't have any talent, and the only thing that we're watching for is a sense of either play with truth games and authenticity, or actually these moments of genuineness, we could probably, if we know that it's all a construction and it's only acting, every bit of it, and it's only about getting the next reality TV job, then what is the pleasure in viewing? Why not actually see a better actress or actor, I should say, perform something that's fictional, if it is all fictional? What does reality TV have to offer? And I feel like, that definitely is part of this, is this kind of opening up of the mode of production that's too visible in the end of this cycle. I think of it as at the end of the cycle. Mm-hmm. But we can also think about ways in which audiences have become disillusioned in the past, right? Historical moments that have preceded this. The quiz show scandals, certainly. Mm-hmm. The way in which the quiz show scandals have come to signify a moment where audiences began a different relationship for television, that they sort of, as a result of this, broke with certain assumptions and agreements they thought they had with television. They felt as though they were duped by the narrative, that, again, commercial interests were overriding concerns for them. They felt exploited. And yet we also know that that's more complex, that there were all sorts of other things going on culturally and industrially at the time that was also already leading to that kind of exhaustion or readiness to let go certain beliefs about television, the veracity of television.
And the way that it's narrativized now in like the history of broadcasting, say that, okay, suddenly there was this abundance of quiz shows and people were really interested and invested in them. And then also suddenly this was exposed as a fallacy.
Right.
And then suddenly, right, even though it was many years later, the FCC chairman gave this speech that said basically that television is a vast wasteland. It's too influenced by commercial interests. And then suddenly, again, 10 years down the road, we get increased government intervention in the ways that, like, who can make television for the networks, if networks
Right.
can be invested in this sort of thing, and then the invention of quality TV as we know it, like Mary Tyler Moore. So there's this very neat line that's
Right.
traced from public disillusionment with the quiz show scandals to the invention of quality television.
Right. But perhaps living with that moment is certainly more complex and confusing. The way that
Yes.
I think we still generally would think that we are in the age of reality television, for sure. And yet I wonder if it has the same hold. Not just are we disillusioned with the narratives and the performers and the production, but does it have the same cultural and sort of imaginary hold that it once did in regards to the interesting timing in which reality TV comes about, right? And this wave, and this is in acknowledging also that this is not, a brand new genre. This is a cycle of a different, of a genre in a new form that really comes, its popularity starts to rise right around the time September 11th happens, and then is only increased. And it's not that September 11th is, directly linked to the rise of reality television, but it sort of forms the context of reception. Mm-hmm. And certainly the fascinations with surveillance and who you can believe and who you can't, and authenticity and truth are all things that were very compelling to us and really were extremely pertinent to the political and social discourse of this period. And now we seem to be entering a different historical moment. And whether or not those questions are relevant to us, I think, is something else to consider in marking sort of the decline of a generic cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that you contextualize, it's fascination with reality TV. This isn't the first time that, like, quasi-live television has been employed, right? I think that sometimes we forget about television's roots in live television, live transmission, and the way that those were seen as, like, the hallmarks of what television could do.
Right.
And the way that it differentiated itself from other mediums. But I think it's also true to think about the way that, there's too much reality television, right? Anxiety about reality television is twinned with anxiety over celebrity, right? The celebrification of our society in general. And I get that a lot studying what I study. People are like, people are so fascinated with celebrities, and what does that say about our culture? And if you look back on the way that star culture has been part of our society, not only since the beginning of Hollywood, but the fascination with public idols of some sort, right? Whether they're associated with a mediated form of entertainment or just with some sort of achievement. So someone like Henry Ford, right? But we have been, we hold up these idols of something, and they are points of fascination and discourse. And it may seem more abundant because there's more streams of information incoming, right?
Yes.
So, and part of that is just because we have an abundance of information in general. But I think that the fascination with stars and the cults of stardom, right? Like, people think that all of this fandom around the Twilight phenomenon is something like new and novel, and it absolutely is not.
Right.
So I think that one important thing that we're trying to do now, you and I, is trying to contextualize this with events and the rise of different spectacular moments and celebrity and reality programming in general within a grander media history.
Absolutely, and I think you're right to remark on the sort of the output is different, and so it might also feel like part of the process of Hollywood stardom, early Hollywood stardom was developing this relationship, certainly about the extraordinary and ordinary, right? That the person is both accessible to you and yet different and distinct and kind of above, that they are real people, but some information about them, so that fan magazines would provide pictures of them in their home, their personal lives, their families, their background, that way that you do get an insight into this person as a person. And yet there's something that's always held back, right?
Yeah, and that's supposed to be the mystery of the star, right? And I think that, there's been some scholarship on reality television stardom, and that's one thing that's missing from the reality star component, is that there's no break, there's no, the real personality and then the performance personality.
Right.
It's all one, right? So you, someone did this article, I can't think of the name, but he did a bunch of interviews with former contestants on The Real World and Road Rules, and how in public appearances had to reproduce the image of themselves as had been edited and put on the personality that was created for them, because that was assumed to be the real them.
Right.
There can't be a split persona there, the way
right.
that there is with other stars. And how, that's just a completely different way of conceiving of stardom, right? I guess in some ways it's the same way that we think of public figures, right? So Barack Obama we don't like to at least think that there's a public and a private Barack Obama.
Right.
It's what we see is who he is.
Right.
It's the same sort of...
True, although we do feel like there's some sort of, I think, again, to return to the savvy viewer, that there's some sort of performance there, but that you're right, that the base of a reality, someone who goes on reality, is that they're really an average person who may have some sort of desires for fame, but they also, are sort of contained within the ordinary, in which... the problematic also becomes when they try to sort of take on too much of the trappings of the extraordinary without having reasons or justified reasons to getting it, talent and so forth, right? So that we reserve for our conception of stardom. And certainly people who have talked about in star studies, there have been hierarchies of stardom, right? And television has been sort of a middling producer of stars, that they too are actually more on the ordinary line. They don't hold as much back because they're in the domestic space. You see them every day. There's something about the intimacy and immediacy of the nature of television that constructs them that way, where film stars are still somewhat, distant and inaccessible. And the reality TV stars might be, right, even further along the line in regards to that sort of function that TV might construct for them. Yeah. Although, there are similarities across that. Sometimes I think that's exaggerated. And yet there's something to that in terms of, I think, accessibility at the very least. But there's something in the Balloon Boy too. And also we haven't talked about the Goslings, who are also, I think, part of this frustration. I found a website called Goslings Without Pity, which I think is a play on television without pity, right? And it's basically fans who just read. It's written like a blog, and there's some where readers comment, and that forms the whole blog post, which is about their recap of certain episodes, which is basically a reading through the lens of what we know about them now, right? So kind of oh, I hate even watching this now, but now I see that Kate is just, being horrible, and, she knows the cameras are there. So it's really taking anything, there's nothing left there that is at least has this veneer. It's interesting. It's well, now we think we know too much, right? But before we thought we were also getting something authentic, but it was, pleasant. And nobody seemed to have any bad intentions.
It's the level of their stardom, right? So before they were just this TLC show that, some people watched, but they were by no means super famous, right? And they were turned into a media event by the publishers of Us Weekly, basically. They found out the scandal. And, people have affairs all the time, people who I'm sure who are involved with these reality television shows. But because it was a dry gossip season, they decided to turn it into manufacture a scandal. Right? Because a scandal doesn't become a scandal until someone calls it that, right? Or until someone reacts to it as scandal. So unlike the Balloon Boy, which you can't deny the newsworthiness, or at least the attention garnered by a giant silver thing floating in the sky, this was very much a manufactured thing that then moved on and kind of self-perpetuated through the entire summer. There's great collages of all of the various covers of the tabloids and Us Weekly and People magazine that featured them, right? Because once they became newsworthy, they had to be covered by all of these other places. Right. Including USA Today and the Today Show and places that we would normally associate with being at least a little bit more middlebrow than, say, Star Magazine. But again, I think that there's, we couple them together now because there was this buildup of fatigue, I think, with the Gosling summer, if we call it that. Right? Yeah. And this is just hitting it on the head. I cannot believe what reality television has driven people to do. Right. And there's something spectacular about the Goslings, which we somehow normalize, right? Is this idea that they're about excess as well.
their excess in terms of their reproduction, their use of reproductive technologies. Yeah. So they're on TLC, which is, an odd collection of its, it has its own freak show component to it in a sense, right? Where it normalizes everything within a scientific discourse and a family discourse, and yet it always tries to show us families, but that are extraordinary in some way or another, that they're fascinated with difference and spectacle of the body in terms of differences. And this, like, large families, which is actually really fascinating in regards to moving from a period of excess to a period that we're in a recession where everybody's supposed to cut back, right? So excess children also start to signify, taking up resources. And the kind of confluence of the sort of hatred for the Goslings, which is also about exploitation of children, which we were okay about before, but because it seemed to, be a necessary thing, because who can really support 8 children? But now that we see that they're engaging in personal excess in some way, then we see that as problematic. And that they were really not just there to buy their children good educations and nice clothes, but that they themselves were out to buy convertibles and new girlfriends and what have you, right?
Well, and the interesting thing, first of all, the fact that I think that a lot of the anxiety or the anger about this is oftentimes it rotates around the female body, right? And the mother figure. And one of the things that I found really interesting tracking the Gosling scandal through the summer, the magazines kind of like played good cop, bad cop with each of, like, at first the dad was the villain and then the mom's the villain, right? But the interesting thing, they pinpointed all of, like, with one episode when they were, or issue when they were trying to really demonize Kate, is they listed all of her expenditures, right? And how she was basically greedy and using all of the kids' money. But the thing is that all of her expenditures were not things that we would think of luxury items, right? She wasn't buying, like, expensive handbags or, expensive cars, that sort of thing. We think about this a little bit with the husband, like, out on the town and drinking expensive drinks and that sort of thing. But Kate was basically like getting her hair done or getting her nails done or, like, going tanning, right? Like going, like, tanning bed tanning. Things that are, I think, really play up the ways in which, like, actual jealousy of people that you know, right? So someone down the street from you, let's say that you have to tighten your belt a little bit because of our current economic situation, that if this person down the street was still going to have these kind of pretty middle-class luxuries, right, that is something that you can be angry about. Yeah. Whereas I'm not angry at, Angelina Jolie for still flying across the world. That doesn't anger me. It's the small things that I can't have that would anger me.
And it's the contradiction of so much about discourse about modern motherhood is, yes, certainly you can have it all, but that you also should engage in some sort of self-care, right? Absolutely. But not too much self-care. So you should have some sort of me time, but not too much me time. And there was another sort of reality moment, too, where one mother on one of those, I think it was Wife Swap or Trading Spouses, was really taken to task for having too much me time. And so there's a line that mothers are supposed to, to walk that is very delicate in regards to taking care of the self in relationship to taking care of others. And the Octomom certainly is not unrelated to this.
Yeah, and there's a recent thing in Us Weekly about how she has lost 180 pounds, I think, 145. Part of that was she lost like 50 pounds just by giving birth to her 8 children. But the ways in which, like, she is expected both to become a slim and regimented body as a mother, right? But then also to somehow care for all of these kids without assistance somehow.
And not actually care about her body so much either. That's also suspect at the same time. Yes, they make fun of her body, and yet they also, remark about plastic surgery. How did she get money to do that? Those kinds of things. Exactly. Her obsession with celebrity, both for herself and that she tried to make herself look like Angelina Jolie, which is interesting, right? Because Angelina Jolie is an interesting figure in terms of excess and motherhood and how we track her, right, as viewers. But yet she has... both the confines, sort of the support of some sort of normalcy, but then, also a different kind of stardom that was, the narrative of her stardom is recuperative, not dysfunctional. And which I think brings up the issue of, in the dysfunctional discourses around stardom, that stardom itself can sometimes be dysfunctional, whether it's that you are a child star and therefore, there's something about the pressures and surveillance of stardom that constructs a disfigured personality at the base of it, which Lindsay Lohan has one recent example, right? Or we see women, there's a lot of female stars that seem to experience this. Britney Spears, another one, Courtney Love, who wasn't a child but has a similar kind of thing. Amy Winehouse, right? That somehow stardom is inherently kind of a deforming process if not treated correctly, and is also addictive.
All those stars, it turns their bodies monstrous, right? So Britney Spears shaves her head, and Amy Winehouse, because of her drug use, her teeth start falling out. Or Lindsay Lohan's emaciated body. All of these things, where it's they lose their signifiers of femininity and desirability, and they cannot no longer function within society because of this massive attention onto themselves.
Right, and their bodies swung too far one way or the other, which is a Courtney Love thing, right? Where she's always, she gets out of rehab and she's larger, and then she's destroyed by that, and then she's too skinny, and this kind of impossibility of the female star body. But it's certainly present in how reality TV and its claims and promises of stardom, and some of those promises result also in are either seen as suspect or are resulting in dysfunctions of one sort or another. And then as a viewer, feeling as though you participated in or created that is also another sort of uncomfortable place.
Yeah. Well, and I think, as a point of conclusion, we can kind of wrap around to this recent editorial by Frank Rich in the New York Times. It's basically a defense of the Balloon Boys family, right? He states that, part of the reason that this father and this was driven to these kind of what we now are kind of pathologizing means is that the economic condition and the milieu of of his particular situation, right? So he was a construction worker. He couldn't make ends meet. So what were his options as a laborer?
Right. And so directly linked to the housing crisis, that is.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. So he can't get work in Colorado. What can he do? He can try to cultivate himself and his family as basically a spectacle.
Right.
And hope that would, in some way, attract the attention of the nation. So this idea that this is maybe the only means of providing for your family, right? So we're in this post-labor, post-production society that only through celebritification can you make money for your family. And that was what this particular man was driven to, and that we are all party to this situation, right? Our viewership, our consumption of these characters leads to this particular situation.
Yeah. And which I think is a familiar sort of, when anything goes wrong or gets too much, that we get that kind of discourse too, that we are, part of the problem, and then that causes perhaps more sort of angsting and processing of whatever cycle that we just experienced.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it.
That was great.
Great chatting.
Yeah.
And,
all right. Thank you.
You soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.